History is often written by the victors, by the quill pens of the aristocracy, where those of lowly birth remain forever merely shadows on the margins of the pages. But there is an exception, a seismic shift that once shook the entire East in the 15th century. A story so paradoxical that historians of the time trembled as they recorded it. It is the story of those deemed barbarians, men with skin as black as the night, shackled and transported from the distant African continent to the humid Bengal Delta to serve as slaves. They were purchased not for hard labor, but to wield swords to protect the lives of noble kings. But then, when the blades were sharp enough and loyalty was eroded by the rot of royalty, those guardians did the unthinkable. They turned their spears, slaughtered their own masters, and stepped over pools of blood to sit upon the throne. They became the first and only black sultans to rule a mighty Islamic kingdom in India. This is not just a coup, this is the roar of lions rising from servitude. Welcome to the bloody and proud epic of the Habshi dynasty. If you are moved by the untold corners of history, take a second to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. Your support is the torch that lights our way in search of lost legacies. Let the journey begin. Chapter 1. Black sails on the Bay of Bianjialin, the final years of the 15th century. The monsoon winds from the Indian Ocean brought not only salty moisture and tropical storms, but also a peculiar flow of human resources pouring into the fertile Ganges Delta. It was an era when the Sultanate of Bengal, a jewel of the Eastern Islamic world, was at the peak of material prosperity yet began to show deep cracks in its power structure. On massive tick merchant ships cutting through waves from the Red Sea, crossing the Indian Ocean to dock at Chittagong alongside silks, ceramics, and spices, there was a special commodity offered by Arab merchants at exorbitant prices. These were the Habshi men, also known as Abyssinians, hailing from the Horn of Africa, where modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea stand. They were unlike any inhabitants of this land, with towering statures, muscles rippling as if sculpted from black basalt, and extraordinary endurance against scorching heat or tropical plagues. The Habshis were considered the most perfect war machines of the time, but what made the sultans of the Ilyas Shahi dynasty crave them lay not only in physical strength, in a court rife with usurpation plots, where brothers were ready to poison each other's chalices, and native generals were always plotting rebellion. These foreign slaves were seen as the absolute safety solution. They were strangers, rootless, with no family backing, ignorant of the local language, and completely isolated from the outside society. Their destiny, their very life and death, were entirely tied to the king's breath. Sultan Babak Shah, the ambitious king of Bengal, was the one who threw open the doors for destiny to flood into his palace. Obsessed with safety and desiring to build an invincible guard, he imported thousands of Habshi soldiers en masse. Imagine the scene of the capital city of Gaur at that time, amidst magnificent temples intricately carved, amidst the soft silk robes of the fair-skinned nobility. There suddenly appeared a living wall of black surrounding the throne. 8,000 black soldiers, clad in gleaming armor, stood motionless like statues of the god of death, their fiery eyes looking in only one direction, their monarch. Their presence was both a symbol of authority and a terror to anyone harboring treacherous thoughts. But history always knows how to hide ironic smiles behind the velvet curtain. Sultan Babak Shah and his successors made a fatal mistake that many empires before and after them would fall victim to. They handed swords to the strong to protect themselves, but forgot to teach the strong true respect. In the eyes of the Bengal aristocracy, the Habshi soldiers, even if promoted, even if draped in gold-embroidered robes, remained essentially barbarians bought with gold. That silent contempt crept into every glance, every smirk of the court officials as they passed the honor guard. And they did not know that, behind those cold faces and absolute obedience, those barbarians were watching. They watched the weakness of their masters. They saw kings who only knew how to indulge in fine wine and beauties. They saw a ruling machine rotting from the inside, from slaves stripped of freedom, torn from the arid Ethiopian soil and thrown into a strange land. The Habshi soldiers gradually realized a brutal truth of power. He who holds the sword holds the destiny. They were no longer lifeless tools. A new ideology, a wild ambition began to kindle in the barracks of the royal guards. When night fell upon the Ganges, whispers in their native tongue began to rise, not to mourn their slavery, but to discuss a tomorrow without masters. The seeds of rebellion were sown, not by external enemies, but by the very arrogance of those sitting on the throne. And when the time comes, the black blood flowing in the veins of desert warriors will stain the marble steps of the Gaur Palace red, opening a bloody chapter of history that no one could have foreseen. ****. When the first rays of the tropical sun pierced through the gold-plated domes of the capital city of Gaur, that light did not merely illuminate the opulence of the Bengal court but also reflected harshly off the cold, iron armor of 8,000 Habshi soldiers. In the power structure of the palace, they existed as a living paradox, a presence both tangible and invisible. They stood there, towering like pillars of black bronze, guarding every corridor, every gateway, every slumber of the king, yet were viewed as soulless shadows. To the local aristocracy, these Abyssinians were merely walking tools, beasts tamed by money and discipline. But there was one thing those arrogant superiors could not comprehend. The silence of these soldiers was not emptiness, but the accumulation of a subterranean storm waiting for the day to erupt. The life of a Habshi guard within the Forbidden Palace was a sequence of days spent observing and enduring. They were completely segregated from civil life, forbidden from mingling with the natives to ensure absolute loyalty. It was this very isolation that inadvertently created a glue binding these expatriate men together into an unbreakable unified block in those high-walled barracks where only the sounds of sharpening swords and nightly prayers resonated. They were no longer separate individuals. They became a giant living organism with 8,000 heads but a single heartbeat. They saw the weakness of those they were protecting. They witnessed the all-night feasts where wine flowed like rivers and morality was cast aside. The contempt the nobility held for them gradually transformed into a sharp weapon in their minds. Why did those weak, debauched figures have the right to command the mightiest warriors? Why must the red blood of black men be spilled to protect rotting thrones? Sultan Babak Shah, in an effort to consolidate power, inadvertently handed these slaves the keys to the kingdom. He granted them higher titles, allowed them to control the armories, and held key positions in the military to counterbalance native generals. But he forgot a fundamental law of nature. When you raise a pride of lions to guard your house, you must ensure you are always stronger than them, or at least, you must feed them enough so they do not crave your own flesh. The Habshi soldiers, from the position of slaves regarded as barbarians, began to realize their true standing. They no longer bowed in fear of leather whips. Their eyes now looked straight ahead, a gaze full of pride and scrutiny. They realized that inside this gilded cage, they were not the prisoners but the jailers holding the keys to life and death. The black shadow beside the throne had now grown to large enough to begin swallowing the very light of sovereignty, signaling a brutal usurpation about to unfold without a single word of warning being uttered. To understand the fire about to consume the capital, one must look at the pile of dry, rotting wood stacked up decades ago. That is the irreversible decline of the Alias Shahi dynasty. By this time, the dynasty once renowned throughout the East had become old and exhausted, like a giant ancient tree hollowed out by termites from within, leaving only a flashy outer shell to cover the emptiness inside. The last sultan of this lineage, Jalaluddin Fateh Shah, was the clearest embodiment of the impotence of royalty. He was an intelligent king but lacked the necessary ruthlessness of a wartime monarch, a man who wanted reform but was bound by the tangled strings of power factions within the court. The atmosphere in the Gower Palace at that time was thick with a scent of suspicion and treachery. Local officials, who once swore allegiance, now split into factions, secretly plotting their own schemes to tear apart power. They looked at the king not with respect, but as a dying prey. In desperation and the ever-lurking fear of assassination, Fateh Shah made the most fatal mistake of his life. He turned his back on his own people and placed his entire existence into the hands of the Habshi mercenaries. He believed that these foreigners, with no roots or ties to the native aristocracy, would be the sturdiest shield protecting him from daggers in the back. The king granted them stipends, authority, and even absolute trust, turning them into the only force allowed to bear arms within 10 paces of the throne. But that very act of empowerment exposed the king's weakness before the eyes of the Black Guards. From their vantage point, the Habshi soldiers saw clearly the hollowness of the empire. They saw a lonely king, trembling on the throne, issuing orders that no one truly listened to. They saw a corrupt court where the law was bent by money and honor was a luxury no one bothered to mention. The divine awe they once held for royalty gradually vanished, replaced by cold contempt. Why should a lion serve an aging gazelle? That question hovered in the minds of the Habshi commanders, growing louder by the day. The Ilyas Shahi dynasty dug its own grave by thinking that money could buy eternal loyalty. They did not know that when state power weakens, it creates a deadly vacuum, and that vacuum invites the strongest, most ruthless to step in and fill it. And in the darkness of the palace corridors, black hands, calloused from wielding swords, began to tighten their grip not to protect, but to prepare for a fatal pounce to finish off a dynasty that had reached its end on the history of great coups. The true danger often comes not from the enemies screaming at the borders, but from those standing silently right behind the throne, those who bow the lowest but see the furthest. In the Bengal court at that time, that figure of destiny was named Shahzad. He was a eunuch, a Habshi man stripped of his procreative instincts to serve in the most secretive inner chambers of the royal family. To the world, a eunuch was merely a pitiful creature, a harmless defective tool, good only for folding clothes and attending to concubines. But it was precisely that physical incompleteness that nurtured in Shahzada an ambition more complete and terrifying than that of any whole man. He moved through the palace like a phantom, soundless, leaving no trace. The position of a eunuch allowed him access to places where even the Grand Vizier or the general could not step. He heard the whispers of the king in his drunkenness. He saw the fear in the queen's eyes. And most importantly, he held the strings of the intricate web of court information. Shahzada did not view the world with the eyes of a slave. He viewed it with the eyes of a master chess player waiting for his opponent to make a mistake. He realized that the power of Sultan Jalaluddin Fateh Shah was merely an illusion. The king ruled by title, but it was Shahzada's own Habshi brothers who ruled by the sword. Shahzada's hatred did not explode loudly like a straw fire. It was cold and sharp as ice. He hated the world that had made him a cripple, hated the light-skinned nobility who always looked at him with half eyes of contempt. During the long sleepless nights guarding outside the king's bedchamber, a mad but mesmerizing thought began to germinate in the eunuch's mind. If destiny had stripped him of the ability to create life, he would use these very hands to strip life from others and rewrite destiny. Shahzada began to drip poison into the ears of the guard commanders. He did not speak of betrayal, he spoke of justice. He awakened the pride of the black warriors, turning their humiliation into rage. He was the brain, the architect of the collapse, the one who turned the brute muscle of the Habshi army into a poison-tipped dagger, ready to plunge straight into the heart of the dynasty whenever he gave the signal. As the sun dipped west of the Ganges, the capital city of Gaur sank into slumber. But in the barracks of the Habshi army, a different atmosphere prevailed, thick and tense as a bowstring drawn to its limit. This was no longer a resting place for soldiers after a weary day of watch. It had become the headquarters of a silent revolution. Under the flickering light of oil-soaked torches, black faces scarred by battle huddled together. They used no paper or ink to record their plans, for to them, a spoken word was a blood oath, and silence was the only shield against the eyes and ears of the court. The high-ranking Habshi commanders, men who had once sworn to use their bodies as shields for the king, were now discussing his death. They had realized a naked truth that Shahzada had pointed out. The king needed them to survive, but they did not need the king to exist. True power did not lie in the scepter or the jewel-encrusted throne. Power lay in the hands of those holding the weapons. In those secret meetings, the line between loyalty and treachery became thinner than ever. They recalled the scornful looks of the officials, the meager wages compared to the blood and bone they had spilled, and they realized they were protecting parasites who lived off their labor. The sound of sharpening swords in the dead of night was as chilling as the grinding of death's teeth. It was not preparation for a battle on the field. It was preparation for a bloodbath right within the Forbidden Palace. The plan was drawn up in meticulous detail: who would seize the city gates, who would neutralize the native guards, and who would have the honor of ending the shadow of God on earth. There was no hesitation, no remorse. To the Habshi soldiers, this was not a crime. This was liberation. They believed they were reclaiming a debt that fate had borrowed from them. The whispers of the blade spread from one man to another like an incurable plague, transforming 8,000 royal guards into 8,000 executioners waiting for a signal from the darkness. And that signal lay in the hands of no one other than the eunuch Shahzada, who smiled coldly toward the brilliantly lit palace, where the poor king still slept soundly, unaware that the scythe of the Reaper was already against his neck. If a king's power is measured by territory, then his ambition is measured by the height of the architectural works he leaves behind. Saifuddin Firoz Shah, though hailing from a distant land, etched his name into the Bengal sky with a masterpiece of brick and stone, the Firoz Minor towering amidst the ancient capital of Gaur. This minaret was not merely an observation post or a place for the muezzin to call for prayer. It was a loud, tangible declaration of the Habshi status. With its sky-piercing height, the Firoz Minor resembled a giant black finger pointing straight to the heavens, asserting to the gods and humanity, "We arrived, we conquered, and we are here, equal to the most brilliant civilizations." The construction process of this tower was also an epic of harmony. The most skilled artisans of Bengal, who once feared the black warriors, now worked under the king's patronage to create exquisite terracotta patterns running along the tower's shaft. The 5-story structure of the Firoz Minor, with the bottom 3 stories being 12-sided polygons and the top 2 being round, symbolized stability and perfect fullness. The red of the fired bricks under the sunset glowed like the blood of the warriors who had fallen to build this dynasty. To Saifuddin, every brick laid was not just to build a tower, but to build national pride for his countrymen, those who had been torn from their African homes and thrown into slavery. Standing at the top of the tower, gazing out over the winding Ganges and the vast rice fields, Saifuddin perhaps felt the ultimate loneliness of one standing at the peak of power. The Firoz Minor is a legacy, proof of his piety and benevolence, but it is also a tomb burying unspoken confidences. It reminds later generations that there was a time when Abyssinian slaves did not accept a destiny of bowing down. They held their heads high to build great works. That tower still stands firm through the ups and downs of history, through rain, sun, and war, like a silent and proud witness to a short but radiantly glorious dynasty. But alas, Prosperity under the hand of a wise monarch is often as fragile as a dewdrop on the tip of a blade of grass. Saifuddin Firoz Shah, the lighthouse of justice and wisdom, was extinguished after a brief reign of 3 years. History does not clearly record whether he died of illness or from a dose of odorless, colorless poison in the royal goblet, but his sudden departure left a vast power vacuum, a black hole sucking all order into chaos. As the soul of the benevolent king left his body, the demons that had been suppressed for so long in the hearts of the Habshi generals began to awaken, baring their fangs and claws to reclaim their position. Saifuddin's death was the whistle signaling the return of old ghosts' greed, jealousy, and primal brutality. The brothers who had stood shoulder to shoulder building the Firoz miner now looked at each other with the suspicious eyes of predators. They had forgotten the lesson of unity, forgotten that their strength lay in discipline, not in infighting. A fierce power race began behind the closed doors of the palace. There were no more discussions about art or policies to comfort the people, only whispered calculations of who would be the next to hold the treasury key and the royal seal. The one chosen to succeed, or rather the one who won the bloody internal struggle, was Muzaffar Shah. But unlike Saifuddin, Muzaffar did not carry the heart of a ruler. He carried the heart of an executioner. He ascended the throne with the paranoia that the whole world was against him. Benevolent policies were abolished, replaced by harsh laws and ruthless purges. Darkness once again enveloped the capital of Go. The people of Bengal, who had just kindled a glimmer of hope for a peaceful life, now had to live in extreme fear. The ghosts of the slave past, of discrimination and violence, had returned, haunting this dynasty and pushing it rapidly down the slope of destruction. The Habshi dynasty, which had risen like a legend, was now strangling itself with its own hands. If Saifuddin Firuz Shah was the radiant dawn, his successor, Shamsuddin Muzaffar Shah, was the pitch-black night without a single star. History often holds ironic cycles. When absolute power falls into the hands of a man lacking virtue, it transforms him into a monster. Muzaffar ascended the throne not by consensus, but by the bloody swords of internal purges. He understood better than anyone the price of betrayal, and precisely because of that, he saw enemies everywhere. Paranoia eroded the mind of this king, turning the magnificent palace of Gaur into a colossal prison where no one was allowed to trust anyone. Under Muzaffar's reign, silence was gold, and a slip of the tongue could cost the lives of an entire clan. Muzaffar Shah ruled the kingdom with an iron fist wrapped in fear. He dissolved advisory councils, stripped the native aristocracy of their power, and replaced them with his most ruthless cronies, to satisfy his bottomless greed and pay for an ever-expanding army of mercenaries. He imposed taxes so harsh they cut to the bone of the Bengal people. The lush rice fields that were once the pride of the kingdom now echoed only with the cries of farmers. He squeezed the strength of the country like squeezing a lemon, indifferent to the life and death of his subjects, as long as the palace treasury remained full. The image of the brave Habshi warrior protecting justice from years past was now completely replaced by the image of bloodthirsty executioners, spreading terror wherever they went. Muzaffar's cruelty not only caused public resentment but also fractured the very unity of the Habshi bloc. Old soldiers who had followed previous kings, men who still held within them a shred of integrity and honor of a warrior, began to feel disgusted by their master's behavior. They realized they were protecting a mad tyrant who was smearing filth onto the legacy they had worked so hard to build. Muzaffar committed the greatest mistake of all dictators. He thought violence could extinguish all resistance. He did not know that violence only compresses hatred deeper, so that when it explodes it becomes a volcano consuming everything. And that volcano had begun to rumble, signaling that the end of a dynasty was drawing very near. The last drop eventually overflowed the cup. The anger suppressed for 3 long years under the brutal yoke of Muzaffar Shah finally found a guide. It was Alauddin Husain Shah, the shrewd and ambitious Arab vizier. Unlike Muzaffar, who only knew how to use brute strength, Alauddin was a master of political art and psychological warfare. He silently connected opposing factions, from the Muslim aristocracy to Hindu leaders, from disgruntled generals to the starving masses. An unprecedented grand coalition was formed with a single goal: to overthrow the domination of the barbaric foreigners. The flag of rebellion was raised, and soon, tens of thousands of soldiers tightly besieged the capital of Gaur, turning it into a lonely oasis amidst a sea of fiery hatred. The siege of Gaur lasted for 4 relentless months, one of the most prolonged and fierce battles in Bengal's history. Inside the city walls, Muzaffar Shah and the elite Habshi royal guard were backed into a corner. Though isolated and short on food, the warrior blood in the Abyssinian veins had never cooled. They fought with the frenzy of wounded beasts, repelling wave after wave of rebel attacks. The walls of Gaur were stained red with the blood of both sides, the sound of clashing swords ceaseless day and night. Muzaffar, in his desperation, still believed that the superior military strength of the Habshis would help him turn the tide. He did not believe that the weaklings outside could defeat his invincible army. However, Alauddin Husain Shah fought not only with swords but with hearts. He ordered his soldiers not to slaughter civilians, promising a future of peace and prosperity if Muzaffar were destroyed. Those promises were like invisible arrows piercing the city walls, shaking the fighting will of the Habshi soldiers inside. They began to ask themselves, why die for a tyrant? Why fight against an entire rising nation? The atmosphere inside Gawa became suffocating and reeked of death. The suspicion Muzaffar had sown now returned to bite him. He no longer trusted anyone, not even his closest guards. In the darkness of the siege, a tragic ending was gradually becoming clear, where the most dangerous enemy no longer lay outside the gates, but had crept right into the minds of those holding the fort. If Saifuddin Firuz Shah was the radiant dawn, his successor, Shamsuddin Muzaffar Shah, was the pitch-black night without a single star. History often holds ironic cycles. When absolute power falls into the hands of a man lacking virtue, it transforms him into a monster. Muzaffar ascended the throne not by consensus, but by the bloody swords of internal purges. He understood better than anyone the price of betrayal, and precisely because of that, he saw enemies everywhere. Paranoia eroded the mind of this king, turning the magnificent palace of Gaur into a colossal prison where no one was allowed to trust anyone. Under Muzaffar's reign, silence was gold, and a slip of the tongue could cost the lives of an entire clan. Muzaffar Shah ruled the kingdom with an iron fist wrapped in fear. He dissolved advisory councils, stripped the native aristocracy of their power, and replaced them with his most ruthless cronies, to satisfy his bottomless greed and pay for an ever-expanding army of mercenaries. He imposed taxes so harsh they cut to the bone of the Bengal people. The lush rice fields that were once the pride of the kingdom now echoed only with the cries of farmers. He squeezed the strength of the country like squeezing a lemon, indifferent to the life and death of his subjects, as long as the palace treasury remained full. The image of the brave Habshi warrior protecting justice from years past was now completely replaced by the image of bloodthirsty executioners, spreading terror wherever they went. Muzaffar's cruelty not only caused public resentment but also fractured the very unity of the Habshi bloc. Old soldiers who had followed previous kings, men who still held within them a shred of integrity and honor of a warrior, began to feel disgusted by their master's behavior. They realized they were protecting a mad tyrant who was smearing filth onto the legacy they had worked so hard to build. Muzaffar committed the greatest mistake of all dictators. He thought violence could extinguish all resistance. He did not know that violence only compresses hatred deeper, so that when it explodes it becomes a volcano consuming everything. And that volcano had begun to rumble, signaling that the end of a dynasty was drawing very near. The last drop eventually overflowed the cup. The anger suppressed for 3 long years under the brutal yoke of Muzaffar Shah finally found a guide. It was Alauddin Husain Shah, the shrewd and ambitious Arab vizier. Unlike Muzaffar, who only knew how to use brute strength, Alauddin was a master of political art and psychological warfare. He silently connected opposing factions, from the Muslim aristocracy to Hindu leaders, from disgruntled generals to the starving masses. An unprecedented grand coalition was formed with a single goal: to overthrow the domination of the barbaric foreigners. The flag of rebellion was raised, and soon, tens of thousands of soldiers tightly besieged the capital of Gaur, turning it into a lonely oasis amidst a sea of fiery hatred. The siege of Gaur lasted for 4 relentless months, one of the most prolonged and fierce battles in Bengal's history. Inside the city walls, Muzaffar Shah and the elite Habshi royal guard were backed into a corner. Though isolated and short on food, the warrior blood in the Abyssinian veins had never cooled. They fought with the frenzy of wounded beasts, repelling wave after wave of rebel attacks. The walls of Gaur were stained red with the blood of both sides, the sound of clashing swords ceaseless day and night. Muzaffar, in his desperation, still believed that the superior military strength of the Habshis would help him turn the tide. He did not believe that the weaklings outside could defeat his invincible army. However, Alauddin Husain Shah fought not only with swords but with hearts. He ordered his soldiers not to slaughter civilians, promising a future of peace and prosperity if Muzaffar were destroyed. Those promises were like invisible arrows piercing the city walls, shaking the fighting will of the Habshi soldiers inside. They began to ask themselves, why die for a tyrant? Why fight against an entire rising nation? The atmosphere inside Gaur became suffocating and reeked of death. The suspicion Muzaffar had sown now returned to bite him. He no longer trusted anyone, not even his closest guards. In the darkness of the siege, a tragic ending was gradually becoming clear, where the most dangerous enemy no longer lay outside the gates, but had crept right into the minds of those holding the fort. The end of the Habshi dynasty did not come like a sudden storm, but rather as the inevitable collapse of a structure built on a foundation of violence and suspicion. After 4 months of siege, when food in the city of Gaur had run dry and the hearts of men had scattered, the fortified city gates, once deemed impregnable, finally swung wide open. It was not due to the destructive power of the enemy outside, but because the trembling hands inside had decided to surrender to fate. Alauddin Husain Shah, with the cunning of an old fox, had infiltrated the very last stronghold of Muzaffar Shah. History holds many variations regarding the death of this tyrant. Some say he fought to his last breath like a lion cornered, while others claim he had his throat cut by his most trusted guards as a gift to present to the new king. Whatever the truth may be, Muzaffar's death marked a bloody full stop to the imperial dream of black people in Bengal. As Muzaffar fell, chaos flared up one last time before fading away. A brutal purge took place that very night. The remaining Habshi soldiers, men who once held the life of the entire kingdom in their hands, were now hunted down like wild beasts. The sound of clashing swords and desperate screams echoed through every corner of the capital, mingling with the crackling of fires burning the last remnants of the old regime. The Habshi dynasty, existing for barely a decade, collapsed as quickly as it had risen. It was like a shooting star blazing across the night sky, blinding and full of power, but then extinguished, leaving behind the silent darkness of history. Alauddin Hussein Shah ascended the throne, ushering in a new prosperous dynasty that lasted for decades thereafter. But in the hour of victory, looking at the piles of black warrior bodies at the foot of the citadel, perhaps he too felt a shudder of awe. He understood that he had just defeated the most formidable of enemies, those who had taught this land a brutal lesson on the power of will. That short-lived empire had fallen, but its echoed the roar of slaves who dared to rise and master their destiny would resonate forever as a warning to any ruler who dared to underestimate the strength of the downtrodden. When the dawn of peace returned to the Ganges, the fate of the surviving Habshis was decided by a harsh yet humane verdict of the victor: expulsion. Alauddin Hussein Shah, though he detested Muzaffar's brutality, acknowledged the terrifying military might of the Abyssinians. He did not wish to slaughter them all, but he dared not keep them within the kingdom. And so, a tragic exodus began. Warriors who once breathed fire, who once sat on golden palanquins, now silently gathered their belongings and boarded ships to leave the land they had considered home. They scattered everywhere, drifting to the Deccan, Gujarat, or becoming wandering mercenaries in other Islamic kingdoms of India, carrying with them memories of a brief golden age. But though the people had left, their legacy remained, standing tall and proudly challenging time. The Firoz miner still reaches up to the azure sky of Bengal. The intricate patterns on the terracotta bricks still tell the story of the refined aesthetic sense of Saifuddin Firuz Shah. Those architectural works do not lie. They are irrefutable proof that black people were once here, not as slaves, but as creators of civilization. The Habshi dynasty, though later historians called it the Dark Era due to political chaos, from another perspective, was an epic of ascent. It shattered all medieval prejudices of race and class, proving that royal blood is not determined by heaven, but forged by humans themselves in red fire and cold water. Closing this dust-covered page of history, we realize an eternal truth. Power may change hands, dynasties may rise and fall, but the desire for freedom and human dignity is immortal. The Habshi soldiers, from nameless figures chained in slaveholds, stepped to the pinnacle of glory and then vanished into the void. Their journey is the embodiment of the flow of history, cruel, fierce, yet full of poetry. Whenever we look at the ancient ruins in Goa, let us remember that black giants once walked this earth, and the echo of their footsteps still resonates in every grain of soil, every brick reminding us of an era when the impossible became possible.